The door was already open. Brooke's hand hadn't left the knob. Behind her, a stranger's fork stopped halfway to his mouth, frozen the way people freeze when a room stops making sense. Nobody at my table moved. Nobody said a word. There was a folder at every place setting instead of a plate, and the smell of coffee where the gravy should have been. By the time my son screamed in my own dining room, I had already spent 6 weeks becoming a stranger to him. I just hadn't told him yet. 6 weeks before that, none of it existed. Not the folders, not the silence, just a dinner invitation from my son, and one sentence I was supposed to smile through. I did smile. It was the last mistake they ever watched me make. 6 weeks earlier. Welcome back to Alpha Mom Stories. I'm Athena Morgan. We tell real stories about the women who hold families together and what happens when someone mistakes that for weakness. This one gets loud. My mornings hadn't changed in over a decade. Coffee first black in a chipped Ashford Public Library mug I'd owned since the year Lily was born. Then the newspaper, then the coupons, clipped out of habit, not need, and stacked in a rubber band on the counter, whether I used them that week or not. I drove a 2014 Camry with 61,000 miles on it, the same car I'd bought used the year Walter died. It ran fine. I saw no reason to replace something that still did its job simply to prove a point to people who weren't paying attention anyway. For 35 years, I sat in finance meetings where I was the only woman at the table, sometimes the only woman in the building above the second floor. For the last 11 of those years, I sat at the head of that table as Chief Financial Officer of Caldwell Industrial, signing off on numbers that would have made most rooms go quiet if I'd said them out loud at my own dinner table instead. I retired the year Walter got sick, not the year he died. I wanted the time with him more than I wanted the title, and I've never once regretted that trade. Nobody in my family ever asked what that job had actually paid, not in 11 years of Sundays. I don't think it occurred to any of them that there was a number worth asking about. My dining room held the same oak table it always had. Walter and I bought it the year we married secondhand even then. It sat 8 with its extension leaf in, and it still carried a faint water ring near one corner where 3-year-old Chase had once set down a juice box and forgotten it overnight. 38 years, and I never sanded that ring out. Some things earn the right to stay exactly as they are. Every Sunday, without exception, that table filled with my son's family. Pot roast or roasted chicken, always a vegetable. Nobody finished. Always dessert, always entirely free. I never once let anyone leave money on that table. And to be fair, nobody had ever once offered to. I could have told them the truth about my accounts any Sunday over pot roast in about 4 sentences. Nobody ever asked. That should have told me something, and for a long time I let myself believe it told me something kind. There were more zeros in my fidelity statement than my son had ever thought to wonder about. I didn't hide that fact. I simply never volunteered it, and in 11 years, not one person at that table had volunteered a question in return. Every Sunday at 4:55, headlights swept across my kitchen window right on schedule, and the motion sensor light over my porch clicked on like it was announcing them before they'd even reached the door. 11 years of that same rhythm, and I could have set a clock to it. That particular Sunday, Chase came in already looking at his phone. He sat down, said grace, along with everyone else out of habit more than devotion, and by the time I'd served the pot roast, he was texting Marcus about the car wash thing, under the edge of the table like I couldn't see his thumbs moving from where I sat. Brooke picked my bank statement up off the counter, the paper one I still had mailed out of habit, and turned it over in her hands like it was something faintly embarrassing to be seen holding. "You know they have apps for this now, right?" she said, not quite looking at me. "Nobody prints paper anymore, Athena." Mason wanted to show me a drawing of a dragon he'd made at school, every scale colored in a different shade of green. Lily climbed into my lap before dessert and fell half asleep against my shoulder the way she'd done since she was 2 years old and still fit there easily. Those two were the reason I never once considered skipping a Sunday whatever else was happening in the rest of the house around them. Brooke, meanwhile, had already found the Tupperware in my own cabinet and was portioning the leftover roast into it without asking the way she did most weeks. I never said anything about it. It was $3 a meat at most, and I'd rather feed my grandchildren all week than turn a plastic container into an argument. It was over dessert that she said it, light as anything stirring sugar into her coffee, like the sentence cost her nothing at all. "Do you even remember your PIN numbers these days, Athena?" Chase didn't look up from his phone. Nobody laughed. It wasn't dressed as a joke exactly, though I think she'd have called it one if I'd pushed back. "I remember every PIN I've ever set," I told her, and smiled and passed the pie down the table. I didn't say the rest of it out loud. I remembered every PIN I'd ever set in 68 years of living. I simply didn't see the point in proving that to a 39-year-old at my own table over my own dessert. I found the brochure after they'd left wedged down in the couch cushions, where it must have slipped out of Brooke's bag sometime during dinner. Glossy, tri-folded, the kind of paper stock that costs someone real money to print in a world where everything else is a PDF. The brochure read, "Doyle Family Wealth Solutions, protecting what matters for the next generation." I read it twice, standing there in my own living room with the dishwasher running in the next room, and the porch light still glowing faintly through the front window. I wasn't sure yet which generation they meant. Inside, under a stock photograph of a silver-haired couple laughing on a dock somewhere, they'd clearly never set foot. One line was circled in blue pen in handwriting I didn't recognize as Chase's or Brooke's, because your family's money is safer in one set of hands. Safer. That word again, dressed up now in cardstock and a stranger's careful circling. I didn't throw it away. Whatever else was happening, I'd learned across 35 years of finance never to discard a piece of paper before you fully understand what it's evidence of. I folded it once along the same crease already worn into it and slid it into the drawer where I kept Walter's old bills and warranty cards. It was on my way back to the kitchen that I noticed it again, the calendar icon Chase had installed on my phone 3 weeks earlier, the one he'd called, "So much easier, Mom. We can all see the schedule in one place." I'd thought it was thoughtful at the time. I'd even mentioned it to Ruth as a nice gesture. I looked at that icon for a long moment that night. I didn't open it. I only wanted to remember later that I'd noticed it standing right there on my own kitchen counter, well before anything else had given me a reason to. Ruth Callahan let herself in the side door the way she had for 22 years, a casserole dish balanced on one hip and her reading glasses pushed up into gray hair she swore every year she was finally gonna die and never did. "You look like you're chewing on something," she said, setting the dish down on my counter without being asked where to put it. Ruth had spent 30 years as an ER nurse before she retired. She noticed things other people walked right past. I showed her the brochure instead of answering her directly. She read it, standing up, lips moving slightly the way they did when something mattered to her, not just when she was being polite. "It's never the stranger who empties the account," she said, finally setting it back down like it had a smell she didn't care for. "It's always somebody with a key to the house already." I told her she was being dramatic. I said it mostly because I needed to hear myself say it out loud, not because I believed a word of it. "Maybe," Ruth said, unbothered, "or maybe call somebody who does this for a living, then decide which one of us is right." That was the night I finally decided to call Margaret Halloran, an elder law attorney 2 towns over, whose name I'd kept folded in my address book for years on a neighbor's recommendation I'd never once needed until now. I told myself it was just to update my will. 68 was a perfectly reasonable age for that entirely routine nothing anyone needed to read a single thing into. Ruth waited until I'd poured the coffee to tell me the rest of it. "Brooke was going on about it at book club Thursday," she said, carefully watching my face. "Something about how relieved she was. That you all were finally getting your mother's finances sorted out properly." I set my cup down very carefully on the counter. "Chase hasn't said one word to me about any of this, Ruth." "I know," Ruth said. "They talked about it at book club before they talked about it with you. Sit with that a minute, Athena." I sat with it considerably longer than a minute. I sat with it most of that night. Chase called on a Wednesday, which was unusual all by itself. Chase called on Sundays, if he called at all, and usually only to confirm what time to arrive for a dinner. I was already 3 hours into cooking. "Just us, Mom," he said, warmer than I'd heard him sound in months. My treat, Ashford Grill, Tuesday at 6. No Brooke, no kids, just you and me for once. I said that sounded lovely. I meant it mostly in spite of everything sitting in my kitchen drawer by then. Some small, foolish part of me hoped it might just be that simple, my son wanting to sit across from his mother for an hour, nothing underneath it. In the 2 days before that dinner, I called Margaret Halloran's office and left a message asking about her availability to update some paperwork. Her assistant said Margaret could see me the following Thursday, 10 days out. I wrote it on my kitchen calendar in pen in my own handwriting in the margin, where Chase's app couldn't reach it and never would. Tuesday evening, I arrived at 6, exactly the way I arrive everywhere. The hostess smiled and said, "Right this way, Mrs. Morgan. Your son already requested the good booth." The reservation she mentioned had gone in under Morgan Party of 2. Small words. I noted them anyway, the way I'd note a footnote on a balance sheet that didn't quite add up. He was already seated when I got there, and his phone, the phone that lived in his hand the way other men's wedding rings live on their fingers, was sitting out in his car. He told me that himself, almost proudly, like it was a gift he was handing me before dinner had even started. I noticed that detail before he'd even pulled my chair out for me. We ordered. He talked about work, about Mason's baseball team, about nothing for exactly as long as it took the waiter to bring our entrees and disappear again. Then he set his fork down, and I knew. "Mom, I want to talk to you about something important." He folded his hands the way he used to when he was 9 and about to confess to something. "I've been thinking a lot about your finances, about keeping you safe." "That's kind of you," I said and waited. "Starting next month, I think we should move everything into one account, mine, so nobody can take advantage of you." He said it fast, the way you say a thing you've rehearsed in a car. "It's safer this way, Mom." It's safer this way. I'd read those exact words 2 weeks earlier, circled in blue pen in a brochure that had fallen out of his wife's purse. I didn't tell him that. I wanted to see where he'd go without knowing I already knew. He kept going before I could answer a story about a woman from his office whose mother had been scammed out of $40,000 by someone pretending to be from the IRS. Details, a little too smooth, a little too rehearsed, the kind of cautionary tale that sounds like it was handed to you rather than lived by you. "What's the rush?" I asked. "Starting next month specifically." He answered too fast. "No rush. It's just, the sooner the better, you know, for your protection." There was no real reason in that answer, only the shape of one. I looked at my son, 41 years old, still folding his hands like a boy waiting to be told he wasn't in trouble. And I understood with a calm that surprised even me that I did not yet know everything, but I knew enough to be careful. "That's a very thoughtful thing to bring to me, sweetheart," I said. "Let me look at the logistics." He grinned like he'd already won. He probably believed he had. I smiled and agreed. It was the truest lie I ever told him, and it would not be the last one I told that year, though every one after it I'd tell myself was in service of a truth he wasn't ready to hear yet. If you've ever had someone dress up control as concern and call it love hit like right now because you already know exactly where this is going. Subscribe to Alpha Mom Stories, because what my daughter-in-law does with her own parents 3 weeks from now will make you set your fork down. Comment safer if you've heard that exact line before. Margaret Halloran's office smelled like old paper and peppermint tea, and she went through my file the way I used to go through a balance sheet at Caldwell. Fast, precise, no wasted motion, no sentiment slowing down the read. "Let's see what we've actually got on file first before we talk about anything new," she said, and pulled a banker's box down from a shelf marked Morgan in my late husband's own handwriting, filed there years ago, and clearly forgotten by everyone, including me. Near the bottom of it, she found the document, a durable power of attorney dated 3 weeks after Walter's funeral in the fall of 2019, granting Chase authority over my medical and financial decisions in the event I couldn't make them myself. I remembered signing it in this same building in a different chair. I remembered almost nothing else about that particular week of my life. I only meant for that to cover medical emergencies, I told her. In case something happened to me the way it happened to Walter. It was never supposed to be about money. Margaret took her reading glasses off, which I would learn over the following weeks was her personal version of raising her voice. Athena, on paper this morning your son could walk into your bank without you. Did you know that? I hadn't known that. 7 years of simply assuming a piece of grief-stricken paperwork had quietly expired on its own, the way I suppose some part of me had wanted it to, so I'd never have to think about that week again. It doesn't matter what you meant it for, Margaret said, not unkindly sliding the document across the desk so I could see my own signature at the bottom of it. It matters what it actually says, and what it says is this. You handed your son a key 7 years ago. You never once asked for it back. I sat with that for a long moment in a leather chair that had probably held 100 other frightened women exactly like me before I ever walked in. It occurred to me sitting there that Chase's careful little speech at the Ashford Grill might not have been a genuine request at all. It might only have been a courtesy, the polite version of something he may not have actually needed my permission to do in the first place. Thomas Whitfield's office at First Heritage Trust Company had a view of the parking lot and nothing else, which I appreciated more than he probably realized. I've never fully trusted a financial advisor with a nicer view than that. He laid the actual numbers out on the desk between us like he was dealing cards unhurried, letting me read each figure before moving to the next. $2,350,000 spread across a rollover IRAA brokerage account and 35 years of deferred compensation from Caldwell Industrial that I'd simply let sit and compound quietly since the day I retired. The house paid off free and clear since 2011, appraised at $340,000 more on top of that. Your family has some idea of what you're worth, Thomas said carefully, watching my face rather than the papers. Does it match this? Not remotely, I said. They think it's closer to $200,000 if that, maybe less. He didn't look surprised by that gap, which told me something too. He explained the mechanism plainly in the kind of short sentences I'd have used myself, explaining a merger to a nervous junior analyst and irrevocable trust assets retitled entirely out of my individual name, a corporate trustee, his own company administering distributions by rule instead of by request. No single family member, including me, could simply reach in and take what they wanted once it was properly funded. I asked about the fee structure line by line. I asked about trustee succession in the event First Heritage was ever acquired by a larger bank. I asked exactly how the tax basis would step up for the grandchildren's subtrusts versus a direct bequest made later. Thomas answered every single question like a man who genuinely respected that I already knew what the answers ought to sound like before he gave them. I signed off on bigger numbers than this before Chase could drive, I told him. Don't slow down on my account, Thomas. He almost smiled at that, the first real crack in his professional composure all morning. Then quieter, almost as an aside while he pulled the paperwork toward himself to begin the draft, You're not the first client I've had this year in nearly this exact situation, Athena. Not even close. I didn't ask him to say more than that. I found I didn't need to. The following Sunday, the headlights swept the kitchen window at 4:55 again, right on schedule, and the porch light clicked on like nothing in the world had changed at all. We sat at the oak table the way we always did, Mason and Lily on one side, Chase and Brooke on the other, me at the head where Walter used to sit. The water ring near the corner was still there, half hidden under a serving dish, same as it had been for 30-some years. Brooke brought it up over dessert casual as the weather. So, when do you think the account stuff will be ready? I was thinking maybe we could tell my parents some good news soon. They'd love to see the family taking care of things properly. It would mean so much to them. I'm still working through the logistics, I said and smiled and passed the coffee. Marcus said it shouldn't take long, she went on. He's already looking at how the account structure should work, so once you're ready, it's basically just paperwork. I kept my face perfectly still. She'd never mentioned his last name to me before that night. Marcus Doyle, presumably, though she said it the way you'd mention a family doctor, someone I was apparently supposed to already trust. That's good to know, I said. I smiled and agreed. I was getting good at it. Good enough that Brooke reached over and patted my hand like I was a child who'd finally understood her homework, and I let her, because letting her was cheaper than telling her what I understood. Later, doing the dishes alone, I wrote Marcus Doyle full name, confirmed on the back of an envelope, and added it to the growing stack in my kitchen drawer. Paige came by on a Wednesday alone, which almost never happened anymore now that her own life had gotten so full. She stood in my kitchen with her arms crossed over her cardigan like she was cold, though it was. August warm outside and the windows were open. Chase told me about dinner. She said not quite meeting my eyes yet. The account thing, he said you're thinking it over. Did he? I kept drying the same glass longer than it needed, mostly to give my hands something honest to do. I think you should just let them help Mom. She said it fast, like she'd rehearsed it somewhere on the drive over. It's easier than fighting it honestly. Easier for who? Paige. She didn't answer that directly. Not at first. She said she was tired of being caught in the middle, tired of everyone calling her to relay messages. Nobody wanted to say to each other's faces, directly tired of a lot of things she didn't quite name out loud that afternoon. She didn't mention Eli or his tutoring or any money troubles of her own. I noticed the exact shape of the gap where that explanation should have been sitting. I didn't push into it yet. I only marked the spot the way you mark a soft floorboard to come back to later. I didn't tell her about Margaret or Thomas or the brochure folded away in my kitchen drawer. My own daughter standing right there in my kitchen, and I found myself deliberately choosing what version of my life to hand her that day. That realization sat uneasily with me long after her car had pulled out of the driveway. At the door, she stopped with one hand on the frame, not quite looking back at me. I didn't know about the calendar thing, Mom, she said quiet and fast, like she needed the sentence said and gone before she lost her nerve. I want you to know that, at least. What calendar thing? I asked her. She just shook her head, said never mind, and hugged me harder than the moment seemed to call for, and left. I stood in my own doorway a long time after her taillights disappeared. I didn't understand what she meant yet. I understood somehow that I would soon enough, and that I wouldn't like it when I did. I have spent 35 years learning how to read the parts of a financial document that are specifically designed not to be read closely. FINRA's broker check database took me 4 minutes to search and considerably longer than that to sit with afterward at my own kitchen table, with the light going gold outside the window. Marcus Doyle, registered broker 2003 to 2014. Suspended, then permanently barred from that registration following a customer complaint involving excessive trading. Churning, the industry calls it when a broker trades an account far more than necessary just to generate fees in the account of a 74-year-old widow. The case settled for $85,000. The complainant's name was redacted throughout the public filing. Her age and her situation were not. He hadn't been relicensed since not once in 12 years. Doyle Family Wealth Solutions wasn't a registered broker-dealer or a licensed investment advisor at all, just a name stenciled on a strip mall office door, operating in the gray space between giving advice and needing a license to give it as long as he was careful never to call it advice out loud to the wrong person. I printed the record on my own printer, the ink running low by the last page, and slid it into a blue accordion folder I'd bought that same afternoon at the drugstore for exactly this purpose. It was the first thing that went into it. It would not be anywhere close to the last. 35 years of reading other people's numbers for a living, and the story in his file took me 4 minutes to understand completely, start to finish. A man loses his license for taking advantage of one widow, and a decade later he's still sourcing new widows, new mothers, new fathers through golf leagues and fantasy football groups, one trusting family at a time, one strip mall at a time. I wasn't his first target. I understood that with total certainty sitting alone at my kitchen table with a stranger's redacted name in front of me. I simply intended from that afternoon forward to be his last. Dr. Ellen Bracken's office had a poster of the human brain on one wall, cross-sectioned and labeled in careful print, and a box of tissues on the small table between our 2 chairs, which told me plainly enough how most of her appointments in that room usually ended. She asked me to draw a clock face showing 10 past 11. She read me a list of 15 words and asked for them back 5 minutes later after we'd talked about something else entirely. My grandchildren, my garden, anything unrelated. She asked what year it was, what season, who the president was, where exactly we were sitting, and in what city. For exactly one breath, somewhere around the clock drawing, I felt something close to fear. Not because I doubted my own answer. Because I understood with total clarity how easily one bad night's sleep, one stumble over an ordinary word could be written down somewhere and used against me by people who loved the idea of loving me more than they loved the actual truth of me. I have never in my life wanted so badly to pass a test I was already fairly certain I'd pass, because passing it meant admitting out loud in a stranger's office exactly why I'd needed to take it at all. I scored in the superior range across every domain she measured that morning. Dr. Bracken signed the report herself at her desk, had it notarized before I even left the building, and dated it in her own careful, unhurried hand. "I've had more referrals like yours this year than in the previous 5 combined," she said, walking me out to the waiting room. "Almost always timed around some big family financial decision. Nobody's ever once asked me why that pattern keeps repeating itself." I told her I thought I already knew exactly why. She looked at me for a moment and didn't disagree with a single word of it. It is a Tuesday afternoon, and I am sitting at my own kitchen table when the calendar notification pushes through to my phone the way it does now for every appointment on the shared calendar Chase set up for me 2 months ago for my convenience. Tuesday, July 28th. 2 p.m. Doyle Referral Conservatorship Consult, C and B. I read it once. I read it a second time, standing now, though I don't remember standing. I carry the phone to the oak table and set it down and read it a third time, like the words might rearrange themselves into something less specific if I just gave them the chance. Conservatorship. Not a vague word. Not a word that means help. It is a legal word, a court word, a word that means someone else gets to decide on paper whether I still count as myself. C and B, Chase and Brooke. I don't need anyone to translate that for me. I understand sitting at the table my husband and I bought the year we married that the dinner at the Ashford Grill was never really a request. It was a courtesy extended to me on the assumption that I would take it, and if I hadn't, this was already waiting underneath it. Built on an incapacity nobody had actually documented because it didn't exist to document. It takes 35 years to build what I built. It takes about 4 seconds reading 2 words on a phone screen to understand that my own son intended to take it a different way than the one he described to my face. I call Margaret. She picks up on the second ring. "Athena. Everything all right?" I tell her what I read. There's a pause on her end, careful, professional. "Are you sure?" she asks. "Move everything," I say. "Now. All of it, Meg." I don't raise my voice once. I want that on the record, even if only to myself. I didn't shout that day. I simply finally stopped waiting. That night, I sat in my dark living room for exactly 1 hour and let myself feel whatever wanted to show up. I'd earned that much, I decided. 1 hour, no longer. I didn't cry the way I expected to. I felt old instead in a way that no clock drawing or word recall test had managed to make me feel. Passing Dr. Bracken's exam had made me feel sharp. Reading that calendar entry made me feel for the first time in years my actual age. Ruth showed up around 9 without calling first. She said later she's just new, and 22 years of friendship had taught me not to argue with that particular claim. She let herself in, made coffee neither of us really wanted, and sat down next to me on the couch without asking what had happened. She didn't offer advice. She'd learned over 2 decades exactly when I needed it, and when I just needed the couch not to be empty. "I'm not angry about the money, Ruth," I said eventually to the dark room more than to her. "I've given money away my whole life. Walter and I raised those kids to want for nothing. I was never going to begrudge them a dime I had to spare." Ruth waited. "I'm angry that not one of them ever just asked," I said. "Not Chase, not Brooke. They built a whole plan, a whole file, a whole appointment with a stranger, all because they thought I couldn't be trusted with one honest question." Somewhere in that hour, sitting with Ruth in the dark, quietly protecting what I had stopped feeling like enough, I didn't want to just survive what they were planning. I wanted them to see it, to stand in the same room as the truth for once, instead of managing it from a distance the way they'd apparently been doing to me. I didn't say that part out loud yet. I just started quietly to plan the table. The next 10 days moved faster than any 10 days had moved in years, and I found I didn't mind the pace one bit. Margaret drafted the trust documents, and I signed them in her office page after page, initialing wherever she pointed, without needing the clause explained to me twice. The 2019 power of attorney was formally revoked, recorded with the county, and certified notice went out by mail to every bank branch that still had it sitting in a file somewhere, a paper trail quietly undoing an older paper trail, which felt in its own small way like a kind of justice all on its own. Thomas moved just as fast on his end, coordinating the trust's funding schedule, so that once I gave final sign-off, the assets could retitle within days rather than months. I had spent my entire career telling other people that speed without documentation was recklessness, nothing more. This was the first time in my life that speed and documentation were finally pointed in the same direction at once, and it felt oddly almost like relief. "We should probably wait on the grandchildren's piece," Margaret said at one point, reading back through the draft. "No real urgency there, given everything else." "The kids didn't do anything wrong," I told her. "Draft it tonight, Margaret." She did. $75,000 each for Mason and for Lily, carved out into their own education sub-trusts, untouchable by anyone but them, and only for exactly what it said on the label. It was that same week I finally called Paige and told her everything start to finish the brochure. Marcus's FINRA file, the calendar entry. Margaret Thomas, all 6 weeks of it laid out in order the way I would once have presented a difficult report to a board that needed to understand a problem quickly and completely. She was quiet long enough that I had to ask if she was still on the line. "I'm here," she said. Then in a voice I'd never quite heard from my daughter before, not once in 45 years. "Mom, oh my God, Mom, I have to tell you something." We're halfway through this story and it's about to flip completely. Comment Team Athena if you're still on her side, and subscribe now so you don't miss what her daughter finally admits next. This is the moment everything changes. Paige drove over. That same night sat down across from me at the oak table and told me the rest of it in a voice that kept threatening to break and somehow never quite did. She'd seen the conservatorship entry weeks before I ever had. Chase shared his digital calendar with her, for carpool logistics, swim practice, and school pickups mostly, and one ordinary Tuesday in June, scrolling past pickup times, she'd seen it sitting there in plain black and white Doyle referral conservatorship consult and said absolutely nothing about it. Not to Chase, not to me. I told myself it wasn't my business, she said, staring at her own hands on the table. I told myself Chase would never actually go through with it. I told myself a dozen different things, Mom. None of them were true. I just needed them to be true so I could keep going. I didn't raise my voice. I asked her one question instead, as plainly and evenly as I could manage. Would you have told me Paige if I'd already lost, or only once you knew for certain I'd won? She didn't have a good answer to that, and I watched her search for one anyway. Watched her come up empty-handed, and I let the silence sit there between us instead of rushing to fill it for her the way I might have, once out of habit, out of a mother's old reflex to smooth things over. Eventually, she told me the rest of it. Eli's tutoring $1,100 a month. They were barely managing to cover on Sam's salary alone. The way Chase had mentioned more than once, almost gently, that we'd all be a lot more comfortable once this was finally sorted. Not a bribe exactly, nothing so crude as that. Just a door left open, a crack the way doors get left open, for people who are already quietly looking for a reason to walk through one. It was your mother, Paige, I said, and that was the only sentence all night I let land as hard as it actually was. She cried for a while after that, and I let her. Then she asked what I needed her to do, and I told her plainly, and she said yes before I'd even finished asking the question. Brooke came by alone that Thursday, carrying her own folder for the first time in 6 weeks. Not blue like mine, hers was black, expensive looking, the kind with a zipper running all the way around it. I thought I'd just help you get the paperwork organized, she said, letting herself in the way she always did, straight past the doorbell she'd never once used in more than a decade. Save everyone some back and forth before things get official. Inside her folder was a power of attorney form already filled out in most of the blanks, along with an account access authorization I recognized immediately as the kind of document a bank requires a good deal more than one signature to properly process. It's basically already handled, Athena, she said, sliding it across my own oak table toward me like she was passing the salt. Just needs your signature at the bottom and we can get moving. She stepped into the next room to take a call a few minutes later to her mother, I'd learn afterward, and I heard her not quite out of earshot the way she probably assumed she would say it plainly into the phone. Athena's been a little forgetful lately. We're just being proactive about it, that's all. I hadn't forgotten a single thing in that entire conversation start to finish. I remembered it later, in fact, in unpleasant, complete detail. I'm not signing anything today, Brooke, I told her when she came back and hung up. My attorney's reviewing a few things first. I'll let you know when I'm ready. It was the first time I'd said Margaret's name out loud to either of them in any context. Brooke's face did something I had genuinely never seen it do before, not once in 11 years of Sundays. It almost looked like fear, plain and unrehearsed. She recovered fast, though, gathering her folder back up, mentioning as she left that she'd already told her parents it was basically done, and that they were so looking forward to celebrating properly as a family. She said it lightly, like a woman naming a date she had no intention of ever letting move. I smiled and agreed that it sounded lovely. It was the last time in this story I needed to say those particular words and mean nothing real at all by them. Friday, July 31st, one full day before my son's own self-appointed deadline was set to arrive, I sat in Thomas Whitfield's office and signed the last of it. $2,350,000 retitled out of my individual name entirely and into something larger and steadier than any one person's name could hold. The house came with it too, through a retained life estate provision Margaret had quietly insisted on months earlier. The trust would technically own it going forward, but I would go on living in it exactly as I always had, for as long as I wanted to, with nobody's permission required. Thomas read the name off the top of the document before I signed it. The Walter and Athena Morgan Family Trust, he said, turning it so I could see it clearly. Walter never had much money of his own to speak of. He taught shop class for 31 years at Ashford High and drove a truck older than our marriage had been at the time he died. but he taught me the value of a different kind of wealth, the kind nobody could ever quite talk me out of once I understood it, and it seemed only right that his name sat first on this document ahead of mine. I put my pen to the page and thought of him for exactly as long as I needed to, and then I finished signing without another word. The structure was simple enough once it was finally done. Mason and Lily's subtrusts were funded immediately $75,000 each, entirely untouchable, by anyone else. Paige would receive a staggered protected distribution over time, steady and dependable. Chase would too, but his was conditioned on completing an actual financial counseling program. First a real path, back into trust, rather than a locked door slammed shut behind him. I wanted that distinction clearly understood by everyone, including myself, most of all. I hadn't cut my son off entirely. I had simply stopped handing him a blank check disguised as unconditional love. Margaret filed the POA revocation with the county recorder that same afternoon and sent certified notice to every single bank on the old list. By 5 o'clock on paper, in every way that actually mattered, it was finished. The dinner was the only thing left standing between us now. Saturday, August first came and went with my kitchen quiet instead of full of the usual Saturday evening prep for Sunday's pot roast. For the first time in more than a decade, I didn't cook the night before. It felt strange in my hands, having nothing to chop, nothing simmering on the stove by 7 o'clock. Instead, that same evening, I set the oak table myself, slowly taking my time over something that would normally have taken 10 rushed minutes. My wedding china came down out of the cabinet for the first time in years, dusted carefully, piece by piece. At each place setting, instead of a plate, I set a folder, blue identical 5 of them copied that afternoon at the library 2 blocks from my house, the same library on my chipped coffee mug. I called Margaret and asked if she and Thomas would consider joining us for dinner the following evening. She didn't sound especially surprised by the request. "I've done this before Athena," she said gently. "Not often, but before." I asked Ruth to come as well, as my friend, not as a witness, though I suspected, and she probably did too, that she'd end up being both by the time the night was through. Margaret asked at one point on the phone whether I wanted her to simply call Chase directly and deliver the news privately first, quietly, the way a doctor delivers difficult results before the wider family gathers. I told her no. I'd spent 30 years of my career sitting in rooms where men decided things about companies and sometimes about families without ever once inviting me properly to the table. I wasn't about to start managing my own family's future from a hallway, now softening it in advance so that nobody's feelings got bruised in front of witnesses they themselves had chosen to bring. If Chase wanted to build a quiet plan around my table without asking me first, he was welcome to sit at that same table and watch it come apart, the same way in front of everyone all at once, honestly. It was the one genuinely sharp choice I let myself make across 6 weeks of otherwise careful, quiet moves. I made it with my eyes wide open, and I have never once taken it back since. Paige called Saturday night with the last piece of it. Brooke had officially invited her own parents to Sunday dinner, telling them it was finally time to celebrate the family getting organized, the right way, once and for all. Diane apparently was already planning to bring sparkling cider for the occasion. Mason and Lily Page mentioned we're staying the night at a friend's house, Brooke's idea so the grown-ups could talk properly. I was grateful for that much, at least whatever she'd meant by it. I sat with that for a while after I hung up the phone alone in my kitchen with the china still drying on the rack. Roger and Diane Hallbrook had never done a single thing to me except raise a daughter who eventually did. It seemed for a moment genuinely unfair to let 2 people walk unknowingly into an evening built entirely around someone else's reckoning. But I remembered something Diane had told me once years earlier at a wedding shower of all places, over punch and idle small talk neither of us expected to matter later. Her own mother-in-law had needed care near the end of her life, and the money surrounding that care had very nearly split her husband's family. clean in two brothers who didn't speak for 2 full years afterward, an inheritance fought over instead of properly grieved through together. She'd told me the story then, like a quiet warning the way people do when they've genuinely lived through something they never want to watch happen to anyone else again. I didn't think that memory was a coincidence I was meant to sit with entirely alone. I decided to let the dinner stand as planned. Shielding Roger and Diane from Sunday would only mean lying to 2 more decent people in order to protect the 2 who had already lied to me for 6 straight weeks. At the very least, they deserved to know exactly what their daughter was asking them to drive over and celebrate. I didn't make that choice to hurt them. I made it because the alternative was managing the truth for other people's comfort yet again, and I had already spent 6 weeks discovering step by step exactly where that particular road always led. I had 1 quiet hour alone before any of them arrived, and I spent nearly all of it sitting at the oak table with the folders squared neatly in front of each chair, like place cards at a wedding. Nobody there had actually asked to be invited to. I took Walter's old watch out of the drawer where it had sat untouched since 2019 and set it down gently beside the folders. Not because it meant anything practical to the evening ahead, but because some quiet part of me wanted him there for this, in whatever small way a watch can stand in for a man who isn't anymore. I didn't want to destroy my son that night. I want that understood clearly even now this much later. I wanted one last time to be looked at by him as something other than a set of numbers waiting patiently to be managed and moved. I don't know honestly if that was even still possible by that particular Sunday. I only know that I hoped it was right up until the moment I heard the car turning into the driveway. They never knocked. 11 years of Sundays, and not once in all that time did my son knock on his own mother's front door. He simply walked in, the way you walk into a house you've always quietly considered, at least partly your own. I used to think that meant he still felt at home here, still felt welcome. Sitting at that table with the watch and the folders in front of me, I finally understood it had only ever meant he never once thought he needed permission in the first place. The porch light clicked on outside. A moment later, motion sensed and automatic, exactly the same as it had 100 ordinary Sundays before this one. Then I heard it, the sound of the front door handle, simply turning without a single knock first. The door swings open without a knock the way it always does, and Chase steps through first. Brooke is right behind him, and behind her Roger and Diane Halbrook. Diane still holding a bottle of sparkling cider wrapped in tissue paper for an occasion that was never going to be what she thought it was. What they find is not pot roast. Margaret sits at the far end of my table with a leather folio open in front of her. Thomas is beside her. Paige is already seated, arms crossed, jaw set in a way I've never seen on my daughter before. Ruth stands by the counter saying nothing, missing nothing. 5 folders wait at 5 place settings. Coffee is brewing instead of gravy, and the whole house smells like it. Brooke makes a sound I've never heard a grown woman make before. Short, sharp, involuntary, a hand flying up to her mouth as she steps backward straight into her father. Brooke Elaine. Roger says quiet and stunned, "What is this?" Nobody answers him yet. I don't think anyone quite can. Marcus Doyle walks in a full beat behind all of them, invited by my son to bring the paperwork and finally close this out. His own timing, delivering him directly into the one room in Ashford, Ohio, where his file was already printed and waiting. This is the part where they walked through my front door and screamed. I have thought about that sound 100 times since. It wasn't fear, not really. It was the sound of a plan meeting a fact it hadn't budgeted for. Chase recovered first the way he almost always did, turning his own shock into offense before anyone else in the room had even finished processing theirs. "What is this, Mom?" His voice climbed fast. "An ambush! You couldn't just talk to me like a normal person." He turned on Margaret next sharper still, pointing at her like she was the one out of line in this room. "What exactly gives you the right to be sitting at my mother's table right now?" "The same right you've had for 11 straight years." I said, and I kept my own voice at the exact volume I use for everything, no higher, no lower. This is the same dinner you've eaten here every Sunday, unannounced without ever knocking first. I just changed what's sitting on the table. I did try to talk to you, Chase, I added evenly. Tuesday evening at the Ashford Grill. You did nearly all the talking that night if you think back on it honestly. His phone buzzed once in his pocket before he could find anything to say back to that. He pulled it out purely from habit, glanced down at the screen, and I watched something shift in his face as he read whatever was there. A reminder visible even from where I sat across the table. Bank appointment. New joint account. Monday 9 a.m. He hadn't actually waited for my real answer at the grill at all. I understood then, watching him. He'd already scheduled the very next step 9 o'clock the following morning, built entirely on an outcome I had never once agreed to. He shoved the phone back into his pocket like the moment hadn't happened. It had happened. Everyone seated at that table had seen exactly enough of that lit screen to know it for themselves. I didn't raise my voice. I slid one folder across the table to Chase and one to Brooke. $2,350,000, I said. Not $200,000. That's the number you've been planning around, and it was never the real one. I let that sit a moment before I went on. The 2019 power of attorney would have let you into my bank without me. It was revoked July 28th, filed with the county the same day. The trust behind it was irrevocably funded July 31st. I touched the third document without opening it again. I already knew every line. And this is a notarized competency evaluation, superior range every measure, dated and on file with my attorney. Brooke's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. Tuesday, 2 p.m. I said, reading the calendar entry back to them verbatim, the way I'd read it to myself a dozen times since. Doyle referral, conservatorship consult. I assume the C and B was the two of you. I certainly never scheduled it myself. Nobody spoke. I looked at my son. You told me it was safer this way, I said. It was, just not for you. I watched something shift behind Brooke's eyes, in that silence the understanding arriving all at once, that I hadn't simply outmaneuvered the transfer she'd asked for. I'd known about the conservatorship, the real plan underneath the polite one, for over a week before that dinner ever started. I have read 1,000 balance sheets in my life. That folder was the first one that ever told me exactly who my son had become. Brooke found her voice before Chase managed to, and it came out crying but not remotely sorry, a very particular practiced kind of crying, the kind aimed outward at the room instead of inward at herself. This is exactly the paranoid, confused behavior we were worried about. Her voice cracked upward louder than anything that had been said all evening. We were trying to protect you, and you set a trap for us in front of my own parents. Diane set her untouched bottle of cider down on my counter very quietly and looked at her daughter for a long, unhurried moment before she said a single word. Brooke. Her voice was calm in a way that somehow filled the entire room at once. She read a legal document out loud correctly from start to finish. That is not confusion. That is the opposite of confusion. Nobody in the room said anything at all for a moment after that landed. Margaret used the silence that followed. She turned toward Marcus, who was still standing near the doorway with his own folder tucked under one arm like he hadn't yet decided whether to stay or bolt, and laid it out for the room. The same way she'd laid it out for me, privately, weeks earlier. His 2014 FINRE suspension, the $85,000 churning settlement against an elderly widow, and a formal complaint she had personally filed on my behalf with the Ohio Division of Securities regarding his unlicensed activity, with my family specifically. Marcus didn't apologize, not for 1 second. Men like Marcus rarely do in my experience. He said something low and fast about how I had absolutely no idea who I was dealing with and turned sharply for the door. Actually, I said, I called FINRA myself last month, Mr. Doyle. I know exactly who I'm dealing with." He left without another word to anyone. Roger stopped him halfway to the door anyway, one hand half raised, something clicking into place behind his eyes. "Doyle." Roger said slowly, like he was reading a name off a page in his memory. "Rotary Club. You pitched me something almost identical to this 2 years back. I said no. Something about it felt off even then." Marcus didn't answer that one either. The door shut behind him considerably harder than it had opened. Chase tried once more, and this time his anger had nowhere left to stand, so it slid sideways into something softer, and in its own way, worse. "So that's it." His voice had dropped almost to nothing. "Family means nothing now unless there's paperwork attached to it. After everything He stopped there mid-sentence. There wasn't an actual ending to that sentence, and I think we both realized it at exactly the same moment in front of everyone. Brooke reached for his sleeve beside him. He didn't take her hand, not this time, the first small crack I'd noticed all evening between the two of them, and I took no satisfaction at all in noticing it. Paige stood up from her chair then. It was the first time all evening she'd spoken directly to her brother instead of carefully around him the way she'd been doing for years. "You didn't ask her for help, Chase," she said steady. "You asked a stranger named Marcus how to take it instead. There's a difference, and you know there is." Chase looked at his sister the way you look at someone you genuinely didn't expect to find standing on the other side of a room from you. He didn't have an answer for her either, not one word. Nobody filled the silence that followed. Nobody in that room needed to. It said considerably more sitting there empty than anything else spoken at that table all night long. Chase looked down at the folder in front of him for a long moment. He didn't open it. He set his hand flat on top of it instead, the way you'd rest a hand on something you already knew you'd lost. I didn't say what I said next to win anything. I want that understood even now, all this time later. "You should have just asked Chase," I said gently as I could manage. "I would have said no to the account. I would never have said no to you." He didn't answer. There wasn't an answer left in the room for him to reach for. He and Brooke left a few minutes later without another word to anyone at that table. Roger followed them out, silent, a hand at the small of Diane's back. Diane herself stopped beside my chair on her way past and touched my hand just once, just briefly. No words, though it said more to me than most of the sentences spoken that night. Marcus was already gone. The door closed behind them a moment later. Someone actually pulled it shut, this time firm and final, instead of leaving it to swing on its own the way it always had for 11 years of Sundays. The room let out a breath it had been holding for 6 weeks. "Well," Ruth said into the quiet, reaching for the coffee pot, "I'll put this on for real this time." Margaret and Thomas quietly gathered the 2 folders Chase and Brooke had left behind on the table, closing them without comment, the way you close a file on a case that's finished. Ruth finished the coffee nobody really needed anymore, and poured it anyway. Paige stayed and cleared the table herself, plate by plate, the first time in years she'd done that in this house, instead of eating and leaving with the rest of them. I sat at the oak table a while longer, in the same chair I'd sat in for 41 years, and let myself simply be tired. Nobody clapped. Nobody should have. I hadn't won a game that night. I'd only just stopped losing one I never agreed to play in the first place. The weeks that followed moved slower the way real consequences usually do, outside of stories. Marcus's complaint began working its way through the Ohio Division of Securities. No dramatic ruling handed down overnight, just a process, grinding forward the way these processes actually do in real life. Word reached his golf league regardless faster than any regulator could move. 2 of his other clients I heard secondhand through Ruth quietly stopped taking his calls within the month. Chase and Brooke's marriage strained visibly enough that even Paige, once so careful never to say a hard word about either of them, finally stopped pretending otherwise around me. Brooke stayed with Roger and Diane. For a while, which is exactly the kind of phrase that rarely means what it claims to mean on the surface. Chase texted me once 3 weeks later, out of nowhere. I haven't told anyone yet exactly what it said, not even Ruth. I only know I answered it like a woman who had already said everything she needed to say at that table and simply didn't have anything left over worth adding to it. Mason and Lily's subtrusts received their first deposits that same month, quietly without ceremony. I started a new tradition in place of the old one. Instead, pancakes with my grandchildren on Saturday mornings. Now just the 3 of us at my counter. No parents required, no folders anywhere in sight. Sunday dinners at my house are no longer automatic, and they are no longer free. If Chase wants a seat at that table again, he'll bring proof of the work, a finished counseling program, and an actual conversation, not another pitch dressed up as concern. I haven't closed the door. I want to be clear about that even now. I've simply stopped holding it open by default for anyone who assumes they're still owed a key. The table still seats 8. It's just not first come, first served anymore. The hardest lesson of my life came late, that saying no to people who only ever take is not the opposite of love. It's the last truest form of it I had left to give them. If this story reminded you why boundaries are the quietest form of self-respect, subscribe to Alpha Mom Stories for more. Tell me below, have you ever had to protect yourself from someone who called it love? I read every comment.